A plan for victory or defeat. Is the US proposal to reduce the Ukrainian armed forces and withdraw from Donetsk region just an empty promise? Has the turning point in the war finally arrived? Could Zelensky meet with Putin in Turkey? American generals are in Kiev right now, meeting with the Ukrainian president behind closed doors. What will they agree on? Near Perm, some unknown good people destroyed an entire train carrying oil. And the Ryazan oil refinery is in tears after an encounter with Ukrainian drones. All of this right now. Friends, let's welcome Roman Svetan, military expert to the Razborka project. Roman Grigorievich, glad to see you. Hello.
Greetings. I wish everyone good health.
The number one topic that absolutely everyone is discussing right now is a certain Witkoff plan, which he is presenting to Zelensky for review, and as many say, to put pressure on the Ukrainian president in the near future. It includes 28 points. It's still not exactly clear what this plan entails, but based on the leaks currently in the media, there are some very serious warning signs. So firstly, according to The Economist, the US is allegedly demanding that the size of the Ukrainian armed forces be reduced to 40%. That is, out of the 800,000 soldiers currently serving in Ukraine's armed forces defending the Ukrainian state's stronghold, only 300,000 would remain. In addition to this, there would be amnesty for war criminals and the reintegration of Russia into the global economy. And Ukraine would have to give up on joining NATO. But this is just the beginning, I would like to point out. Here's a question for you. Please explain, from a military and political perspective, what such plans might actually be hiding.
You summed it up correctly, these so-called peace plans. They shouldn't be called peace plans. The thing is, a peace plan that would ultimately lead to peace in Europe, on the European continent, consists of just one point. And then it will be a real peace plan. The dissolution of the Russian Federation. Only after the dissolution of the Russian Federation will true peace come to the European continent. Not to Eurasia as a whole, of course, but specifically to the European part of the Eurasian continent. Everything else is just a plan for Ukraine's capitulation. They can't be called peace plans, because any plan for Ukraine's capitulation, no matter what it looks like, no matter how many points or subpoints it has, 28, 2.8, 288, it doesn't matter. It's still a plan for Ukraine's capitulation, and a gradual one at that. And it's not peaceful at all. Why? Because the Russians will definitely keep biting off more and more territory from Ukraine, depending on what they're able to get away with. We've already seen this happen. Just look at the pattern of actions by the Russian Federation since 2014. In 2014, they took a part of Donbass. Minsk won, right? That gave them a few months to restore their forces and resources to regroup and dig in. And then they took the next part of Donbass. Minsk II gave them another chance to bring in reserves to reinforce their troops and resources. 7 years. In 2022, they came in and took a third part of Donbass. If there is a Minsk III now, any so-called plan, but it's really a plan for capitulation, they'll take another piece of Ukraine next. And then they'll keep moving forward. So in other words, that's what they call step by step. That's why the only real peace is the dissolution of the Russian Federation. And plans for capitulation are of no interest to Ukrainian society or the Ukrainian army. No one is going to surrender. Because we understand perfectly well that with Minsk III, if, God forbid, it is signed somewhere, somehow, we will lose not hundreds of thousands, as we already lost with Minsk II. With Minsk I, we lost thousands of people. With Minsk II, we lost hundreds of thousands of people. With Minsk III, we would lose millions of lives. Ukrainians would lose most of their own territory. That's why no one will agree to it, definitely. And there's no point in going through it point by point, because from a military perspective, none of this will have any practical consequences at all. Why is this happening right now? It's precisely now that everyone is discussing all these plans in this context. Several interests have come together all at once. Such serious stakeholders are involved in this process. It just happened to coincide at this moment in time. Let's break it down step by step. The first interested party on one side is Trump. The Russians have caught Trump. Putin really caught him on his desire to stop wars. He gave him the opportunity by somewhat dampening the Middle Eastern problem with his involvement. He gave Trump the opportunity to publicly declare to the whole world that he had stopped the Middle Eastern war. And he went on about this topic for a whole month, broadcasting it everywhere from every possible outlet. Trump told everyone that he was a great American winner, that he stopped the war in the Middle East, and Putin caught him on that, caught him by his word, as they say in the slang of those guys from the St. Petersburg backstreets. He simply started it up again, reignited that war. Now hostilities have started again in the Middle East, and Netanyahu is also involved in this. The so-called great friend of Trump is in fact more of a friend to Putin. The two of them have basically set Trump up now. Trump has nowhere to go. He's in a bind. He needs to find a way to resolve things with Putin so that Putin, together with Netanyahu, doesn't reignite this little war in the Middle East again, so that Trump doesn't end up looking like a complete fool. Right now, he looks like a square idiot. And if this war doesn't stop, he'll look like a complete idiot. That's why, naturally, relations with Putin are of interest at the moment at Ukraine's expense. Trump has his own perspective on these processes. At least for now, he's not being represented by Witkoff, but by Rubio, who also has his own vision. In other words, there's a plan at least to somehow calm Putin down and allow things to settle in the Middle East through this relationship so that Trump doesn't look too bad. There are also other interested parties. For example, Witkoff and Dmitriev are also interested parties. They were removed from the negotiation process, simply removed. They're trying to climb back in or at least jump onto the last car of the train that's rushing ahead at a good geopolitical speed. They were thrown off it. And now they're trying to jump back on, trying to show some kind of involvement, although in reality, they're absolutely nowhere. And in fact, they're practically not allowed anywhere anymore. But nevertheless, they can still throw out some plans, make a name for themselves with them, puff themselves up, and naturally try to draw attention to themselves. Another interested party is Putin himself, because it's important for him to once again state his real intentions regarding Ukrainian territory, his vision regarding Ukrainian territory, and naturally he will now be pushing directly in this context as well, including that. Another interested party is the American news agency, which is greedy for money. We understand perfectly well that a commissioned article in some outlet like Axios costs a lot of money. If there are interested parties who need such a commissioned article, it will definitely be paid for and they will publish it. And then it will be reprinted, sometimes simply multiplied by some other countries. Now, the interested parties are the Ukrainian authorities, Ukraine itself, who want to pit Ukraine and Trump against each other. They've just launched a narrative, it's only now coming out, that Ukraine is against Trump's plan for some kind of peace initiatives. Trump himself doesn't even know about this plan yet. But this so-called opposition is already being created. It's a counterstrike. A counterstrike that now involves, so to speak, Ukraine as well. In this sense, we're simply being set up. That is, in principle, most of the interested parties are actually on Moscow's side. Well, most of them at least. If you consider Witkoff a pro-Moscow figure, then practically all the interested parties are from Moscow's side. And the reaction was very pleasing, the reaction to all of this in general. The wave of information from our European partners. That is, they clearly stabilized the situation, explained that many European leaders have spoken out on this topic, maybe with the exception of Fico and Orban, but for the most part, everyone is united. So a capitulation plan definitely won't work for Ukraine. In other words, no peace agreement, or rather no capitulation plan disguised as a peace agreement will go through. And the British were especially pleasing. They clearly stated their position. Any peace talks only after the withdrawal of Russian.
The demand for the withdrawal of all troops from our territory is a strong and notable position. Well, that is certainly impressive, as it clearly demonstrates a firm commitment to protecting our national sovereignty and the integrity of our borders. This is, in fact, the official stance of the British Crown, which has consistently maintained that any foreign military presence on sovereign land is unacceptable and must be ended. By the way, it is also important to mention that the European Union, as a collective body representing many nations, firmly rejects any territorial concessions as well. But tell me, please, why do you think, after all, that Marco Rubio and even the US Secretary of State are saying that Ukraine will have to make serious concessions? Perhaps they're talking about just a few days that simply need to be endured? What did you notice in these statements? Because to me, this just looks like another turn of the spiral. Trump is once again trying to push this topic, and it seems there hasn't been any success with it.
Rubio, by the way, acted very politically astutely. When the information attack began, presenting those 28 points of Ukraine's complete capitulation, actually even more than what Putin once demanded, practically the total defeat of Ukraine in order not to directly torpedo this so-called message, because then it would have been necessary to fight against the very idea of some kind of peace plan. Rubio acted very wisely. He said that a peace plan should include pressure on both states, not just on Ukraine, because in that proposal, the pressure is specifically on Ukraine. In other words, practically all the capitulation points are directed at Ukraine. There's nothing about Russia. According to the Vitkov and Dmitriev plan, Russia doesn't have to concede anything. No one is putting any pressure on it. And Rubio basically said that there is another plan. In this plan, there is also pressure on Russia, including the fact that Russia will have to make concessions and so on. He basically led and titled this campaign, this wave that was picked up by almost all pro-Russian politicians. He took the lead and has now steered it in the direction that is needed, at least for now. Well, or for the Americans at this moment, meaning Trump. But again, this is Rubio. We need to distinguish between Rubio and Trump. Yes, right now, as Secretary of State, he has to be the channel for Trump's messages and actions as such. But still, Rubio has his own stance. It's very much in the McCain-Reagan, Reagan-McCain tradition. After all, Rubio is a pro-Ukrainian politician, or let's put it this way, a pro-American politician. Of course, a politician, but definitely anti-Russian. Well, that's for sure. There's no changing or restraining him on that. He's not like Vitkov, who gets tossed around like manure in an ice hole. So in this sense, Rubio could even be the next president. By the way, it wouldn't be bad if people from the Raycon or Makin teams ended up leading the states in 3 years or so. That would definitely make things easier and simpler for us. That's why Rubio played his part very well at this stage. So we need to wait a few more days. You're absolutely right. A few days for all the snowdrops to surface so we can understand who planted which snowdrop where.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Roman Grigorievich, well, the Russians are saying that no plans were coordinated or agreed with them at all. If we translate from Ukrainian into Russian, and they also claim that they have nothing to do with these plans at all. Trump said that Putin seems to be sending signals again that he's ready to talk. What do you think about the Kremlin's mood for the near future? Do they really believe that is it possible to push these messages through? Do they hope that the US will now twist Ukraine's arm with these proposals? If so, why? It doesn't seem like their situation on the battlefield is so hopeless that they could count on that. Explain why this is happening.
No, they're not hoping for anything. This is a counterattack. In other words, it's an attempt to strike, including by putting Ukraine in a difficult position to hit Trump and Rubio. And in general, to target the whole team that's trying. They really are trying. One of the main goals for Rubio and Trump is to stop the fighting, to freeze the conflict along the line of contact until the Senate elections next year.
So through this Vitkov leak on social network X, right? Do you just think that he was, let's say, bribed for this kind of activity?
Yes, it's a counterattack meant to neutralize the pressure on Moscow. In other words, they created a message that in principle was supposed to torpedo the White House. And naturally, we and they, first of all, set us up right away. As I already said, it was a straightforward setup. But Ruby handled himself very well, very competently, very correctly. He rose above this. He rose above this wave and said, yes, there is a plan, but it also includes pressure on Russia. And he managed to stay on top of the wave, to stay at the crest of it. And basically, now he will steer things in the direction he needs in the end. So in the near future, we will hear direct pressure on Moscow, plain and simple, especially since it has already happened. No one really paid much attention to it at the time. We, the Americans, have been allowed for quite a while now to do essentially everything, to use all the weaponry and military equipment we have, including advanced NATO-supplied weapons, even against Russia. We have even been permitted to strike targets such as Voronezh's Baltimore airport with ATACMS missiles. So what does it mean to strike Russian territory with ATACMS? These are long-range ballistic missiles with cluster munitions. They allowed everything at once. They're using cluster munitions, they're using ballistic missiles, and striking deep into Russian territory. So at this point, Rubio, together with Trump, have solved our main problem. And that's why, by the way, even Merz has started to raise the question and has begun not just to suggest, but to actually announce the delivery of long-range weapons to us. So that's exactly what lifted the restriction on European weapon systems, which European countries were hesitant to give us without the Americans. So what is this? This is pressure on Russia. And this is exactly the kind of pressure that Putin is now trying to torpedo. That's why naturally they sent out that same Dmitriev. Again, everything came together at once. In other words, they sent out Dmitriev with all these so-called points, which are basically trying to wrap Ukraine's capitulation in this piece of paper. And actually, there's nothing bad for us here, by the way. That is, everyone understood everything. The main thing is to see the action itself. The action is the permission to strike Russian territory. The action is the delivery of long-range strike systems to the armed forces. Action, real actions, not just talk, but actual deeds. This includes even the arrival of those same American generals to us. In other words, it wasn't just Vitkov or someone else who came, but actual generals arrived. And when generals come, especially generals from the Pentagon, they've been involved in this since childhood, or rather, maybe not since childhood, but since military academies. From military colleges, they've had the idea of the enemy drilled into their heads, and it never goes away. First, it was the Soviet Union, then Russia, and now China and North Korea have been added. So for them, it's like a red rag to a bull. In other words, they're trained, their instincts are honed to counter the Russians. So even somewhere deep down, even if they weren't given any specific messages, they will help us. So this is also a good point, a good message. The main thing is to use it correctly. So at the moment, I don't see anything bad. The only thing, of course, is the corruption scandal, which has really damaged the reputation of our government and Ukraine in general in terms of trust.
Yes, to confirm your words about the corruption scandal, what can I say? Honestly, it's like we've messed up and now we have to fix it ourselves. Just now, American generals had a meeting with Zelensky. Dan Driscoll, who is the US Secretary of the Army, along with his colleagues, is currently meeting in an NSDC format with Rustem Umerov and others to discuss support for Ukraine's defense. Roman Grigorievich, to wrap up this diplomatic section, I want to ask you one last thing. To ask you, after all, about the military component. Tell me, what Zelensky said in Istanbul, that it's possible to meet with the Russians and discuss things, is that just a kind of gesture toward those who claim Ukraine isn't ready for negotiations? Or could this round of negotiations actually take place in Istanbul? Because from the outside, it seems like there's simply nothing to talk about. What do you think?
Well, there really is nothing to talk about. Why? Because any contact with the enemy, other than armed conflict while they're on your territory, is capitulation. In other words, as long as the enemy is on your territory and you want to talk to them, it means you're discussing the terms of your own surrender. And if one of the points is to commit to not reclaiming the occupied territories by force, then that's pure 100% capitulation. Because for any army that is waging an aggressive war, the main objective is to force the enemy's army to give up armed resistance. So raising these capitulation issues, well, that's something that absolutely cannot be done in Ukrainian society. But there's nothing to say, to just send them in the direction of the Russian warship, since Trump himself is still running around like a fool with the idea of freezing hostilities and a peace plan that amounts to Ukraine's capitulation. Well, that's not exactly proper either. And that's why you have to maneuver between the raindrops. There's simply no other way. So it's one thing to talk and another thing to actually do. As a military man and also an analyst, including a military analyst, one must analyze actions as such. So far, actions show that no one is planning to capitulate. That's the first point. Secondly, capitulation is technically impossible. We simply cannot abandon certain constitutional norms. It's just not possible. Again, technically, because we would fall outside the legal framework of our constitution. The second and third most important things are the support of our partners, including America as well. I've already talked about the ATACMS and the position of the military delegation as well. So for now, we can judge by actions. That no one is going to force us to capitulate, that's for sure. And ahead lies the pressure on the Russian economy to dissolve the Russian Federation. Just like the Soviet Union was dissolved back in the day. No one defeated the Soviet Union. No one broke up the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was dissolved. The republics that realized Moscow was no longer of any use, that it could no longer pay for government services, simply went their separate ways. And they began to live peacefully until Moscow once again decided it wanted to take part in the process of gathering up the so-called former colonies. So one of the ways to defeat the Russian army is to dissolve the Russian Federation, because any army is a derivative of the state. No state, no army. because that's exactly what everyone is starting to work on now.
And now, on the 21st, we are waiting for serious sanctions that were promised against Lukoil and Rosneft. In conclusion, please comment. After all, the Ryazan oil refinery is blazing again tonight, and we see a sudden fire on the railway in Perm-Krai. An entire huge train loaded with petroleum products was destroyed there. After all, this is a sign that talk is just talk, but actions are being taken. And
that's exactly what I'm talking about. We need to comment and pay attention to the facts, so-called, and especially to actions, particularly during combat operations. In Perm, they put several barrels of fuel into the train and set them on fire, meaning they accomplished a combat mission. These could have been informants for our intelligence services, they could have been agents of our intelligence services, or they could have been concerned citizens, as I call them. In other words, these are resistance forces trying to break free from Moscow's control. They help us, meaning they are working toward our common victory. So now within the territory of Russia, we have our friends, the resistance forces of the republics, who are working toward our common victory, which will ultimately lead to the dissolution of the Russian Federation and the destruction of Moscow, even up to the destruction of Moscow as the so-called metropolis. As for the strikes on Ryazan, there was a complex attack there, including a strike on the Ryazan oil refinery, a repeated strike. That's 17 million tons per year lost. And that's already several percent of the total volume of Russian petrodollars gone, especially considering Ryazan itself. There's also the so-called technological corridor there, one of the main technological corridors for the analytics of Moscow and the Moscow region. This is preparation for a blackout in Moscow. That's why I say Moscow needs to be shut down. And Moscow can be shut down since we don't have ballistic missiles yet, ones that could reach Moscow 500 kilometers away. It's possible to shut down and destroy the 8 technological corridors through which electricity enters Moscow, not just the Ryazan oil refinery, but also the Ryazan State District Power Plant. That's a state district power station which operates as a synergistic power accumulation facility where electricity from several nuclear power plants is supplied. From the cascade of Volga power stations, hydroelectric plants on the Volga, these are already balancing capacities. And then it is transmitted through PES, intermediate power stations of 500 and 750 kilowatts to Moscow. This is a technological corridor. Plus, from the Ryazan oil refinery, several product pipelines carrying diesel, gasoline, and aviation kerosene go to Moscow. That is from the Ryazan oil refinery. There's also a serious blow here, and we shouldn't forget about Diaghilevo in Ryazan, Diaghilevo airfield, which is home to one of the main pilot retraining centers. And the main aircraft that pose a threat to us are the Tu-95 and Tu-22M3. The Tu-95 carries Ka-55, or rather 555 Ka-101 missiles, and the Tu-22M3 carries the Ka-22 missile, which is particularly dangerous for us, because this kind of complex for us is a whole field of work. There's no end to what needs to be done, because things have flown, are flying, and will continue to fly to Ryazan.
Thank you, Roman Grigorievich Svetan. This was the Ukraine Today channel on the program Razborka. Stay healthy, Roman Grigorievich. All the best.